In the 1970s, movements for civil rights intensified and changed amid a drastically shifting political climate. And that's not to say that the political climate caused the movements to change or vice versa, but rather that the existence of these fluid and dynamic social movements, intensity over debates surrounding our involvement in Vietnam, and growing distrust in the government in a general sense led to a huge shift in the way that Americans looked at their relationship to each other and their representatives. So when we think about civil rights in the 70s, we have to think about it not just in terms of people demanding greater access and equality, but demanding these things in relation to one another and the structures of oppression at large. One of the things we start to see happening during really the mid 60s and into the 70s is the restructuring of America's two major political parties. A lot of times we hear this referred to as a flip in the parties in the sense that Republicans from Lincoln's time become Democrats today and vice versa. And this isn't necessarily the worst way to think of it, but it's not necessarily the most accurate way to think of it either. Because it's not like everyone woke up one day and decided to just change parties. This is a process that happened over time, something we've actually been following for a while now. So, in an extremely simple version of this lengthy process, here's what happens. During the Reconstruction era, we've got our radical Republicans and our Democrats. The radical Republicans, if you recall, are the ones responsible for things like the Reconstruction Amendments, otherwise known as the 13th through 15th Amendments. They also create things like the Freedmen's Bureau and pass the KKK Act. But as those people get tired of Reconstruction being expensive and really just annoying to deal with as more Democrats are allowed back into the federal government, their dedication to making all of this work falls apart, which is where we get the Compromise of 1877 with the election of Hayes. Now, pair that with the widespread corruption that's happening in the Republican Party during this time period, because remember, the Republicans are also the party of big business, and now you've got Republicans who are really just more interested with moving on to the money of the Gilded Age than with what's going on in terms of civil rights in the South by the 1890s. And Democrats are pretty chill with this because they can set up their Redeemer governments in the South without too much trouble. So skip forward to the Progressive era. Wilson is elected to the presidency as the only Democrat of our progressive presidents. Now, he's still ridiculously racist, which suits our Southern Democrats just fine, but this is sort of scooting in the direction of Democrats accommodating more progressive policies. But because none of the progressive things he's enacting are detrimental to the South, they don't really care too much. The same will go on, more or less, for Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal. Roosevelt passes sweeping liberal changes that send up all kinds of red flags to all kinds of conservative Democrats who otherwise would be seriously alarmed by the expansion of the federal government under his presidency. But Southern Democrats, who he needs the support of in order to get anything passed, make him agree that anything he wants to do has to include provisions that are essentially a buffer to Jim Crow. So, for example, all of the really great labor laws that Roosevelt passes have exclusions that would prevent African Americans from taking advantage of them. They always exclude groups like agricultural workers and domestic laborers. They also sign off on all kinds of legislation dealing with labor unions because the South didn't really have any major industrial centers in the 30s, so they didn't have any reason to be afraid of labor unions. And the ones that they were worried about, they had other ways of squashing. So again, Democrat Roosevelt can follow his liberal agenda without upsetting the balance of Jim Crow racists in the South. This gets a bit messy after World War II for a few reasons. One, those labor unions that Southern Democrats weren't worried about before now become a problem because all that Sunbelt migration and the military-industrial complex has brought new industrial jobs to the South. And because the laws that already exist because they signed off on them, they now have to abide by those, which means that these labor laws apply in theory to everyone regardless of race or gender. So if a minority individual, by race or gender, can manage to get a job at one of these places, they're in theory in a good spot, which is great for them, but disrupts ideas of Jim Crow segregation and conservative ideas of people knowing their place, which is bad for our Southern politicians. So now a lot of them are a lot more sympathetic to the Republican Party, who, if you remember, have never really liked unions to begin with because they've always been the party of big business this whole time. And two, if you remember from our discussion of the Great Depression, we've got a lot of African Americans who start voting Democrat during and after the New Deal because they realized that the Republican Party was just not there for their interests anymore. Now, this is not to say that Southern Democrats are there for them either, because they're not. Like, Southern Democrats are the ones actively preventing African Americans from voting. This is literally the entire reason why we have separate groups like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that's trying to lobby for putting up black candidates and registering black voters in the South, because they know full well that the big Democratic Party isn't going to run a black candidate in Mississippi. But this also means that white voters in the Democratic Party increasingly don't want to be associated with these newly empowered black voters in their party. So they're willing to go looking for new options when someone comes along and is calling for them, which brings us to Nixon. Before we dive into this, let's point out that Nixon isn't the first person to ever use racist language and dog whistling to get people to buy into his politics. Generally speaking, Barry Goldwater actually used it first in 1964 in response to the Civil Rights Act. But because Goldwater didn't win, and because Nixon really perfected the idea in his Operation Dixie strategy in 68 and 72, we often talk about it mostly with him. So what then is Operation Dixie, or the Southern Strategy as it's more commonly called? The basic idea here is what Lee Atwater is explaining on the quote here on the right. He says here that in the 50s, it was perfectly fine to rile people up using the N-word and appealing to them with overt racism. But by the mid-60s, you couldn't do that anymore. It wasn't politically acceptable. And so politicians had to come up with other ways of appealing to white people's racism without actually using overt racist language. So they'd say things like that they wanted to eliminate school busing, which was used to force integration, or they wanted to cut taxes, which were used for war on poverty programs, things like this. According to Atwater, economic things and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. By the 80s, this turns into Reagan saying that the U.S. should focus on really not seeing the color of people's skin, but being colorblind. But then he turns right around and fabricates stories about welfare queens, which literally everyone ends up associating with black women, even though the vast majority of people on welfare have always been white. When I was a kid in the 90s and early 2000s, the push was to move into gated communities and put my brother and I into a private school so that we would be around the right kinds of kids, which begs the question, what are the wrong kinds of kids? Nixon specifically does a lot of focusing on what he refers to as law and order, which I'm sure anyone alive in the last few decades is super familiar with as a phrase because it's been the cornerstone of Republican politics ever since this point, essentially. So, in line with the Southern strategy, the idea here is to associate crime with African Americans and other racial minorities, and then go around stressing that your administration is going to be tough on crime, or in favor of more police funding, or in favor of law and order, which is really an interesting concept since the majority of places where they're screaming this into crowds are areas like suburbs, where we know full well that black and brown populations have been systematically excluded from living anyway. But the idea is to prey on people's fears and the reason why they don't want to live in urban areas to begin with. And so in this spirit, Nixon starts the war on drugs, which is really just one in a long line of wars on abstract things like the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror, and so on. So Nixon says in the summer of 71 that drugs are public enemy number one, and that it's going to be the government's priority to get rid of drugs, which on the surface, sounds great. I mean, politically, this is a real winner because nobody wants to come out against it and be like, no, I want drugs in my community. But what this is hiding is the really ulterior motive for what he's after. If you look at the quote from John L. Richman here, he admits quite honestly that the war on drugs is really about, quote, getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily so that they could disrupt those communities. So what these calls for law and order do is really get what used to be Southern Democrats really more comfortable with the idea of voting for a Republican like Nixon because now he's speaking their language. And that's the Southern strategy. It's to go into the South and use things that sound like policy issues, but are really issues that target minority communities and put a nice face on them. And that's That's at the same time that Nixon is doing this, he's also appealing to blue-collar workers and other people who would normally be constituents of the Democratic Party under the same philosophy of this us versus them mentality. Because at its core, the Southern strategy isn't just about the South. It's about taking certain groups of people and pitting them against other groups of people using vague language and rhetorical questions that aren't really based in any actual facts, but are there to stir up drama and tension. And it's effective enough that politicians on both sides of the aisle still use it in some form today. For women, one of the biggest fights of the 70s was the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which, if you recall from our discussion of civil rights in the 60s, was one of the main goals of the National Organization for Women. The ERA, as it's more commonly referred to, was first put forward by Alice Paul in 1923, and then subsequently ignored by pretty much every Congress after that until the 70s. And when Congress did finally approve it, the language very simply stated that equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So in theory, pretty simple. But in reality, the ratification of the amendment by the states, which had an initial deadline of 7 years, was complicated. The amendment faced backlash by conservative women like Phyllis Schlafly, who claimed that placing women on an equal footing with men in the United States would reduce the rights of wives to be protected by their husbands and other men and harm family values as more women left the home to compete with men politically and economically, which is mostly ironic since Schlafly herself was a lawyer. But we have to remember that even among a growing feminist movement, there is still a large population of women with conservative views of family values and marriage who widely agreed with her and her ideas. Many of these women grew up in very traditional homes where they learned and believed, sometimes due to deeply held religious views, that a woman's proper role in life was to be a helper to her husband and a moral center for her family and community. And so the idea that the ERA would then pressure women to suddenly propel themselves into the public sphere and damage this relationship between woman and home was something that they fought against with a fervor that we see in really a lot of fights involving things of religious significance. And because we know super well at this point that Americans tie Protestant ideals to democratic ideals, these women and their supporters often tied the downfall of these conservative ideals and wholesome family values to the downfall of democratic American values themselves. And so at the end of the 7 years, and then an additional extension of a few years after that, the ERA failed ratification by 3 states. In January 2020, Virginia actually became the 38th state to finally ratify the amendment, several decades past the deadline, which begs the question, what now? Largely, this is something that Congress and the states will have to determine. In theory, since Congress set the original deadline, they should have the right to extend it once again to make the ERA the 28th Amendment. But needless to say, the debate over this particular amendment seems far from over. Women weren't the only ones fighting for tangible legal reform in the 70s. Inspired by civil rights movements across the United States, Indigenous Americans around the nation organized to fight for cultural reclamation and legal redress as part of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, during the late 60s and 70s. AIM used protests and a radical form of sit-ins to draw attention to the atrocities and long-standing legal issues perpetrated by the U.S. government against Indigenous nations for centuries. Sometimes referred to as the Red Power movement, almost akin to the Black Power movement, AIM's 2 major goals were pretty simple: preserving Indigenous culture and upholding treaties. They also introduced the term Native American as a replacement for Indian as a more appropriate way of addressing tribes at large. When it comes to major actions by AIM, 3 stand out. In November 1969, a small group of Indigenous people led by Richard Oakes, a Mohawk, began an occupation of Alcatraz Island that lasted for over a year and a half. If you're not familiar with Alcatraz, it's an island that's been used as a prison by the U.S. government for most of the time that they've claimed it. The purpose of this occupation was to reclaim the island for Indigenous peoples and force the government to turn it over to be used as a cultural heritage site with an education center and a museum and other places of learning. After all, the government wasn't using it. They had shut it down a while before that. And so more and more people start showing up, some with more dedication than others, over the course of this 18 months. The population on the island during the occupation changed over time. For example, when college students were out of school, you'd see a lot of young college-age people there showing their dedication to the cause, although they would leave the second that school was back in session, so I don't know how much we'd call that dedication. But in any case, it got to the point where by 1971, the government, and therefore the FBI, becomes increasingly unwilling to negotiate with the changing leadership at Alcatraz. And then there's a tragic accident where one of the leader's young daughters falls down a stairwell and dies, so they move in and force them out. In 1972, AIM protesters took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C. for nearly a week. In theory, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was meant to be an advocate for indigenous peoples within the federal government, handling agreements between tribes and ensuring that agreements were paid out or allocated correctly. But as we've seen throughout this course, this has rarely been the case. BIA officials, more often than not, use their position to make a profit off government contracts or trustee positions. Those who don't are generally so disinterested in the work that they're tasked to do that reservations slip further into starvation with each decade. And so in 1972, part of the purpose of the siege of the building was to send a message. But the other part was really very practical. They were there looking for documents. Several tribal nations had been caught up in litigation with the federal government for years, sometimes decades, waiting for payments or land grants, and often the paperwork required to get things moving was stored away at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And when tribal leaders requested copies of treaties or other paperwork, they were met with red tape or told that documents just didn't exist. And so during the siege of the building, protesters also took important documents with them that they needed in court, or at least copies of them. Then in 1973, we have the siege at the Pine Ridge Reservation, better known as Wounded Knee. The problems here started before the drama of the actual siege, though. The Oglala Lakota tribe living at the Pine Ridge Reservation wanted to get rid of their chairman, Dick Wilson, who they thought wasn't putting the interests of most tribal members first. They saw his leadership as mostly corrupt and giving priority to more assimilated members of the tribe rather than people who preferred to live a more traditional lifestyle. So in 73, the tribe asked members of the American Indian movement to come in and help them get rid of Wilson. AIM's strategy was to occupy the nearby town of Wounded Knee, the historic site of the massacre by U.S. troops in the 1890s. In almost a deja vu-like fashion, the National Guard and federal marshals arrived to force them out, but the siege lasted for 71 days. About 6 weeks into the occupation, a sympathetic pilot tried to airdrop food to the AIM activists, and federal agents shot at them and killed one of the protesters. This ultimately led many of the Oglala tribe to call for the start of negotiations and the end of the siege. Some people, white Americans in particular, looked at these events with mixed levels of sympathy and anger at things like seeming destruction of government property. But for the members of AIM, like members of many other more radicalized civil rights groups in the 60s and 70s, the ideas of their leaders and actions of the group were really reactions to decades and even centuries of systemic racism and government oppression. For members of AIM and other groups, loud and very public actions like these were some of the only ways to bring attention to causes that they felt were otherwise ignored. When potentially well-meaning white liberals suggested resources for tribes to take their causes more peacefully or logically through the courts, they had to be educated on the fact that not only were the tribes fully aware of these resources and processes, but they'd actively been working through these official channels for decades without hope. And in this way, their struggle reflected that of the African American civil rights movement and the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who in the wake of radical reactions and violence across the nation said, quote, "I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity." While a lot of civil rights groups were in essentially the middle of a group identity crisis, or at least fracturing, during the late 60s and 70s, critical events in the LGBTQ+ community during that period meant that some of these groups were really just beginning to set terms of self-definition and collective goals. That's not to say that gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals didn't seek out better treatment by people in the law before this, but that modern modes of communication and organization methods of other civil rights groups made it easier to collectively organize and protest in ways that weren't so easy before. A lot of times, the dominant narrative of the LGBTQ plus movement centers around the idea that the Stonewall riot was a starting point for all activism. And this is a really simplistic and neat narrative, but it also just really isn't correct. We know from lessons before that organizations like the Mattagine Society and Daughters of Bilitis existed in the 50s, and even in the 60s, protests were happening on the West Coast in cities like Los Angeles. And even the Stonewall riot in '69 itself is often shrouded in misconceptions. In the very early hours of June 28, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn, a known gay bar in New York City. This particular bar was run by essentially mobsters, which means that with all the rest of the shady things that they were doing there, they didn't care that their patrons were doing additional illegal activities, like the quote, solicitation of homosexual relations. And the cops in this area of the city, Greenwich Village, knew exactly what the bar was because they busted it up pretty regularly. Typically, the bar would be given advance notice before a raid, but not on this June evening. And so the police raided the bar and proceeded to arrest anyone that they considered to be what we would call cross-dressing, or wearing 3 or more pieces of not gender-appropriate clothing, which is, of course, subjective to each officer. Again, this is all pretty normal for this kind of bust. Where things start to get a bit ugly is when the police start to put what many historical narratives characterize as mostly, quote, lesbian and transvestites into police vans for arrest. A crowd that had gathered to watch the raid started throwing more or less random street objects, bottles and bricks, etc., at the police, which caused them to retreat into the bar. The cops called for reinforcements who had to put out flames that had been set to burn down the bar before evacuating the rest of the cops and getting rid of the rioting crowd. But it wasn't only that night. Crowds of rioters appeared night after night to riot for the next week or so and sparked protests across New York City. Their efforts also organized more formally into the first Pride Parade in New York City nearly a year later. In the American mind, Stonewall has become a central part of the LGBTQ plus movement. Things were either before Stonewall or after Stonewall. And to an extent, the bottling up of tension that was released in this singular week in time is worth examining as a significant point. But we also have to remember that this is one event in one place that had a very specific context. And the things that come after it might not be as publicized, but are incredibly important for the movement as a whole. In the summer and fall of 1969, new organizations grew out of movements for gay rights. The Gay Liberation Front started in July and organized in small groups on college campuses and in communities across the country. Their primary issue wasn't with internal support, but with connecting with other support networks nationally. The GLF didn't see their oppression as any different than the kinds of oppression faced by other groups, African Americans, the Latinx community, women, Indigenous Americans. But the problem was that these groups didn't necessarily identify with them. For example, when they reached out to groups within the Black Power movement, they found many to be unwelcoming to LGBTQ issues. This was especially the case with the Nation of Islam, which was strictly anti-LGBTQ. Same with the feminist movement. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique has an entire chapter within it that reeks of anti-LGBTQ sentiment. So it's unsurprising that her willingness to support women's issues stopped firmly at straight women's issues, and typically white women's issues. In November 1969, the Gay Activist Alliance split from the Gay Liberation Front after a debate over donating some of their money to the Black Panther Party. Their aim was to focus solely on gay rights issues, which over time led a lot of their leaders to focus more on politics in order to achieve this. Political ambition and just the sort of general nature of doing politics meant that a lot of the members, or at least the leaders of the GAA, became more conservative in their agenda over time. They started focusing less on what they wanted to achieve and more on what they could achieve, or at least what they thought they could achieve. In 1970, 2 original members of the GLF, who were founding members of the GAA, Sylvia Rivera and Marcia P. Johnson, left that organization to form the Street Transvestite Action Revolution, or STAR. They initially left the Gay Liberation Front for the same reasons as everyone else, but thought that the Gay Activist Alliance, while it focused specifically on gay activism, excluded issues of gender identity. Their focus was too narrow. By the early to mid-70s, both the GLF and GAA started folding in on themselves, both from competition from each other and a lack of real support for their agenda. So in '74, they combined together into the National Gay Task Force, which today is the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. So in the post-Stonewall era, one of the first things we see as a change is the creation and constant reimagination of organization created by and for the LGBTQ plus community to define and support their own goals. These organizations created support networks in areas of the country beyond just the large cities where such things had existed before, and put out publications and organized marches to draw attention to their issues. One of the key issues that LGBTQ plus groups advocated for was what's called gay liberation, or what we might more commonly refer to today broadly as pride. The idea here was that a lot of anti-LGBTQ groups at this point were trying to advocate for this almost Puritan-like position that homosexuals might find the most freedom and safety in what they considered their lifestyle by living it in privacy, which is literally very much like what we saw back in the Puritans in the 17th century. If you recall, they didn't necessarily have beef legally with gay members of their community unless those people's relationships were made public and supposedly messed up their community's perceptions of godly marriages and therefore put a stain on their city upon a hill. And so here, the idea is that people promoting this idea are saying essentially that if they can't see it and they don't have to hear about it, they don't necessarily care too much. But the LGBTQ community is like, no, we're not going to live like this. And so they begin promoting the idea of gay liberation, the idea that they need to live their lives exactly as they are, and the rest of the world will just have to catch up to them. And this idea is made really clear here in Carl Whitman's A Gay Manifesto from 1971. These aren't all the points he made, but they're just some of the more critical ones. He is advocating that members of the gay community need to, 1, come out and become active in the community and in politics as an out person. 2, talk to other gay people and help them to understand what gay liberation is all about, understand that some people aren't as ready as others to be out, and accept where people are. 3, keep talking to everyone and don't give up who you are, as he puts it, quote, free the homosexual in everyone. And 4, be yourself, whoever that is, for real. And so kind of the basic concept here is that there has been, or have been, centuries of oppression for LGBTQ plus people in the United States and globally, really. And this is the time to say that's enough. And the best way to liberate the gay community is to just do it, like teaching a kid to swim by telling them to just jump in. What Whitman's words here are critical to understanding is the idea that he totally gets this will be difficult and incredibly uncomfortable and even dangerous for some people. Notice that the first thing says self-defense. But the whole concept that he reiterates in these 4 steps is that these are things that are done together as a community, that they're done openly and with understanding to each person's circumstances. And you just have to keep going and keep talking. The context here is important, though, because without the kinds of groups that we just talked about, the support networks that existed just at this time or as this was written, this kind of liberation and the community and support network required for it would be incredibly difficult. Just like we've seen with all of our other civil rights movements, putting ideas into action only goes as far as well-organized networks can carry it. At the same time that gay liberation sought to challenge public perceptions at large, lesbians within the feminist movement fought specifically to challenge the National Organization for Women. As I mentioned before, the feminine mystique isn't exactly friendly to the LGBTQ community. Betty Friedan carried that discrimination over to now, where lesbian members were actively pushed out in 1970. After this, a group called the Lavender Menace, which is actually what Friedan called radical lesbians, formed out of women who were part of the Gay Liberation Front and the National Organization for Women. One of the women, Rita Brown, even quit her job working for NOW in order to help create the group. In 1970, the Lavender Menace used the Second Congress to Unite Women to distribute their manifesto called the Woman Identified Woman. During the conference, the women created a disturbance by cutting the lights and then turning them back on to reveal the members in their Lavender Menace t-shirts, handing out the manifesto into the crowd. In less than a year, NOW added the resolution on the screen to their policies, recognizing lesbian issues as an issue to be addressed by the feminist movement at large. The changes brought about by the Lavender Menace within the larger feminist movement corrected a massive blind spot in a movement that presumed to speak for women broadly across the nation. But that wasn't the only blind spot in the feminist movement, not even close, really. In 1977, the Combahee River Collective released a statement on their perspective relating to Black feminist lesbianism. The entire statement is presented here on the screen, but I've bolded this part in particular that reads, "Although we are feminists and lesbians, we feel solidarity with progressive Black men and do not advocate the fractionalization that white women who are separatists demand." So what's happening here is that, like we've seen so many times before, we have a group of women who are part of a multi-oppressed group. They're women, they're Black women, and they're lesbians. And so now that we're in the middle of this era of civil rights movements, there are organizations looking at these women and demanding their undivided loyalty over either their time or their resources. And I want to emphasize that it is 100% the right of all women as individuals to not make a choice here. Women are complex people. We have the right to flexibility or to be more than one thing, even choose to give weight or credence to a certain part of ourselves one day over another. But as an organization, the Combahee River Collective here has chosen to make a statement saying that they, with their time and resources, are choosing to support the Black men in their community over the mostly white feminist movement or organizations like NOW. Their reasoning here is really simple. They explained that, quote, our situation as Black people necessitates that we have solidarity around the fact of race, which white women, of course, do not need to have with Black men unless it is their negative solidarity as racial oppressors. And so the message is that, sure, they might have to experience sexism within the Black community, but they'll handle that within the Black community, thanks. For the entirety of the gay community, regardless of race or gender, a substantial step forward came in the form of an announcement by the American Psychiatric Association in 1973. Up until this point, the APA characterized homosexuality as a form of psychological disorder. This is why LGBTQ+ service members were discharged from the military and why people seen to have sexual disorders were sent to asylums or treated, which I use very loosely here, with medications. If you've ever seen the movie The Imitation Game, the World War I British codebreaker Alan Turing was treated through chemical castration by his government after a conviction of, quote, gross indecency, after admitting his relationship with another man. He killed himself less than 2 years later. The removal of homosexuality from the APA's list of mental disorders meant that in at least some cases, it couldn't be used as an exclusionary factor in employment or education, or as a means of punishment by law. Changing public perception, though, obviously takes longer. In January 1977, Miami-Dade County in Florida passed an anti-discrimination bill that prevented discrimination based on sexual orientation in things like employment, housing, and other public areas. So essentially, the county wanted to make it illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ+ people in their community. This sparked the creation of a political coalition called Save Our Children, created by singer and former Miss America runner-up Anita Bryant. Bryant was deeply religious and ran her whole program on the idea that the city forcing Christian and conservative people to accept gay individuals in the community infringed on her ability to teach her kids biblical principles. And so she and the rest of her organization made accusations that sounded more at home in the 1930s than the 1970s, that homosexuals were dangerous and would turn into child molesters, hence Save Our Children, or at best would corrupt children into an immoral sense of family values. By June, the bill was overturned. The following year, her organization and others like it led to the repeal of similar anti-discrimination laws in Minnesota, Kansas, and Oregon. Then, toward the end of 1979, California attempted to pass a discriminatory law referred to as Proposition 6. Just like in all of the other cases, the Save Our Children advocates came out in full force, but what they met was a force of prepared and confident LGBTQ+ activists ready to counter their attacks. The gay community responded with their own campaign called Come Out Wherever You Are, which called on members of the gay community to talk to members of their family, their neighbors, their coworkers, and anyone else they knew to explain how Proposition 6 would personally impact them. And in the end, these personal discussions were more impactful because, one, it reminded people that they actually know gay people and interact with them all the time and that they're literally just normal people. And two, that laws that don't seem to have an impact on some people often have a tremendous impact on others. And so in the case of California, Proposition 6 was defeated. But Save Our Children didn't just disappear. Many historians look at this as one of the beginning moments of the conservative movement. And we see iterations of this all the time. Anytime there's a new moral panic, you see white mothers on TV crying that their children are in danger of being corrupted by gang violence or trafficked or kidnapped, when in reality the actual statistics on all of these things, not the statistics from your grandma's reposted Facebook memes, tell us simply that this isn't the case. But the fact is that people propagate these ideas because it's easy to use children as tools against the big bad other, because white children and white crying women are easy political tools. The movements for civil rights in the 1970s were clearly a continuation of the hard work and foundations of activists from the 50s and 60s. But to see the civil rights movements as singular and linear across time neglects the fact that these movements both shaped and were shaped by changes in the political and international climate they occurred in. We also have to remember that over time, the movements experienced internal division and interacted with each other, creating new ideas about direction and leadership. Moving forward, each of these groups continued working both separately to meet their goals, but also increasingly sought out ways that intersectional relationships might bring about widespread change in the United States.